and welcome to Adaptation, the vlog where we talk about film adaptations and the original material they're based on. I'm Kendall Bryant, and this week, do I have a chain of adaptations for you. Way back at the beginning of the year, we did a video on the best scripts in film adaptations, and my addition to that was You've Got Mail, for its quirky, fun romance and memorable lines. But in that video, Jen admitted she didn't actually know that You've Got Mail was an adaptation, and I thought there might be some other people that were surprised as well, so I thought I'd devote an entire video to all the versions of this story. The very first iteration of this romance was the 1937 play by Hungarian playwright Miklos Laszlo, which was called Parfumerie. Laszlo and his wife Florence translated the play into English in the 50s, but it wasn't actually performed in English until 2009 when his nephew adapted it for a Florida production. There have been a few other English performances since then, one in Canada, another in California, which I was able to read a review of and get a little bit of a feel for the storyline, which seems to have been very similar to the 1940 film version of this called The Shop Around the Corner. True to its original material, the film centers on a shop in Budapest and the lives of its owner and employees. Starring Jimmy Stewart, Margaret Sullivan, and Frank Morgan, this film is really sweet and simple in its tone. The main story starts when Clara Novak comes in looking for a job, and when Alfred Kralik tries to send her away, she impresses the owner, Mr. Matichek, by selling a very hard-to-sell musical cigarette box. Immediately, this causes tension between Alfred and Clara, and they basically resolve not to agree on anything for the next 3/4 of the film. But you probably know where this is going. Each of them has been corresponding with an anonymous member of the opposite sex through letters, and what the audience knows, and they have yet to find out, is they have been corresponding with and falling for each other. Running in a bit of opposition to the romance, the B plot line centers on Mr. Matichek and his crumbling marriage, and his suspicions that one of his employees is stepping out with his wife. I gather that that plot line got equal time with the romantic plot in the original play, and while the film does devote some time to it, it's more as a foil to our romantic leads. Like, they have to work late on the night that they're supposed to meet because of Mr. Matichek and how angry he is about these suspicions, etc., etc. Though it is a really, really close call, I think this might have to be my favorite version. I mean, Jimmy Stewart is amazing, his chemistry with Margaret Sullivan is perfect, and it has a really down-to-earth, realistic tone to it. Not that it doesn't have its moments, but the humor in it is much less obvious than it is in adaptations to come. And while the plotline with Mr. Matichuk is pretty serious, it ends on a really sweet note about the people you work with being a family of sorts. The side plot is actually probably the main difference between The Shop Around the Corner and 1949's In the Good Old Summertime, starring Judy Garland and Van Johnson. In this one, the shop owner, Mr. Oberkugen, and one of the employees have been making googly eyes at each other for years, and the subplot follows them finally tying the knot, and also Mr. Oberkugen realizing that he's never going to be a professional violinist. The main romantic plot stays the same almost word for word, with the exception that we're now in Chicago, and in a ploy to get Judy Garland to sing, we are now in a music shop instead of a perfumery. And she does get to sing about 4 times. In fact, for you Tumblr addicts out there, you know the popular reaction gif of Judy Garland singing I Don't Care in the red dress and doing the weird arm thing? Yeah, that's from this movie. Aside from being more musical, this version is also much more comedic. In fact, the opening scene is a meet-cute outside the post office where Andy Larkin bumps into Victoria Fisher so hard that her hat flies off, her hair tumbles down, and there's this bumbling scene with her parasol and the bird from her hat and the dress getting caught on his bicycle. The entirety of which was choreographed by Buster Keaton, who has an extremely small role later in the film. But speaking of small parts, fun fact, at the end of The Shop Around the Corner, the store hires a new employee, played by Charles Smith. And as I was watching In the Good Old Summertime again, I noticed that one of the gentlemen in the quartet singing with Judy Garland looked kind of familiar, and sure enough, Charles Smith. So he got to be in both adaptations, which is pretty cool. While I really enjoy this version, I have to admit that it's at the bottom of my list. I really don't enjoy the contrived humor, and while I do enjoy Judy Garland and Van Johnson, I honestly think Mr. Oberkuchen and Nellie had a bit more chemistry. The tone makes the film and characters very different from the 1940s version, but they're still spouting the exact same dialogue, and it's just really hard to compete with Jimmy Stewart and Margaret Sullivan. Next up, in the 1960s, there was a Broadway musical version of Parfumerie called She Loves Me, which had a revival in the 1990s on the West End and in Broadway. The story takes us back to Budapest in the 1930s, just like The Shop Around the Corner, and from what I can tell, it follows the storyline pretty closely, with a few more subplots and a lot more singing. It won a couple Tonys and a few Laurence Olivier Awards, so it must be pretty good, but I can't tell you really much about it. But now we've made it to the version that you probably know about, even if you haven't seen it, 1998's You've Got Mail, starring Meg Ryan and Tom Hanks. Back when everyone was still using AOL and a dial-up connection, these two meet in a chat room and start exchanging emails instead of letters like all of our former couples. And now, instead of being co-workers, they are competitors. Kathleen Kelly owns a small bookshop in New York called The Shop Around the Corner, and Joe Fox is part of the family that owns and runs the chain bookstore Fox Books. He puts her out of business, but then wants to be forgiven, and somehow it's believably pulled off that she does actually forgive him. As far as tone goes, this falls right in the middle of the other two. It's definitely a romantic comedy, but it has a much more natural humor that comes from line delivery as opposed to contrived circumstances. And I am convinced that only Tom Hanks and Meg Ryan can pull off being that interesting while staring at a computer screen. The two big additions to this adaptation are that we're actually getting to hear a large amount of the letters that they're sending to each other, as opposed to before we were just hearing snippets, and also that there's kind of this added on third act where Joe and Kathleen become friends despite their past business differences, which makes it a little bit easier to swallow when they find out that they're email friends and the past is forgotten. But what I really love is that through all of these versions, there are two consecutive scenes that stay practically exactly the same, even with the changes in modernization of You've Got Mail. On the night that the two leads are meant to meet for the first time, the male lead always brings his friend to check in the window, who then teases him about what he sees and has to break the news that the girl he's going to meet is the girl that he doesn't like very much. Then the male lead always says he's going to leave her sitting there all night, but he circles back around and tries to pretend that it's totally normal that they ended up at the same restaurant. At this point, the staging is also always exactly the same. He sits down at her table, they antagonize one another, at which point she asks him to leave, and instead of leaving the restaurant altogether, he just switches to a table directly behind her so that they are back to back and can continue to antagonize each other. At a certain point, he decides he needs to come back around to her table so that he can look her in the face, at which point she takes the insult one step too far and actually hurts his feelings. And throughout the entire conversation, even the way that her insults are structured stay the same through all of the versions, as well as his response is always exactly the same. Wow, that was the perfect blend of poetry and meanness. It really makes me want to read the original play to see if that was in the source material. Though these are the only direct adaptations of 1937's Parfumerie, I think it's pretty undeniable that this storyline has been used a lot more. In fact, I bet that each of you could come up with like 3 examples of other storylines where two people are exchanging letters, texts, emails, etc., and don't know that they're actually talking to each other. In fact, let's name them in the comments. I'll start us off with a Cinderella story. Anyway, I think I've accurately displayed my love for all of these films, and I really hope that you'll check them out. Even though they all tell the same story, they're each distinctive in their own way, and I think you could really just pick which kind of style of film that you prefer. But really, I think they're each deserving of at least one watch through, especially if you love comparing and contrasting as much as we do here on Adaptation. Let us know in the comments which of these seems like your cup of tea, and if you've seen the musical or the stage play, please let's talk about it. You can find links to our Twitter, Tumblr, and Facebook in the info section, and of course, a link to our podcast on iTunes. Until next time, keep watching!